I never imagined that an ordinary day, like that March 15th, 2023, could change everything forever. I was on my way to the prayer meeting at church, as I had done every Wednesday for over 30 years. The road was quiet, and I was softly singing a hymn that always brought me peace. But suddenly, everything changed. A huge truck ran the red light, and before I could react, I felt the violent impact. The sound of metal crushing was the last thing I heard before everything fell silent. I didn't feel any pain. In fact, it was as if my body simply stopped existing. Suddenly, I was floating, as if someone had pulled me out of myself. I looked down and saw the destroyed car, the shattered glass, and my body there, motionless. It was strange, but not frightening. On the contrary, a deep peace enveloped me, as if I were being embraced by something greater, something I couldn't explain. And then, everything around me began to change. The darkness gave way to a light I had never seen before. A light that didn't hurt my eyes, but seemed alive, pulsating, full of love. I didn't know where I was going, but I wasn't afraid. It was as if the light was guiding me, drawing me towards something I couldn't fully see. And then, he appeared, Jesus. He wasn't a distant or untouchable figure, as I had always imagined in Bible stories. He was there, as real as you or me, but at the same time, he was something much greater, much deeper. His presence was overwhelming, but not in a crushing way. It was as if all the love in the universe was concentrated in him. And he looked at me with a compassion I had never felt before. I didn't need to ask who he was. I just knew. At first, he didn't say anything, just looked at me with that gaze that seemed to see straight into my soul. And then he began to speak, but not with words as we know them. It was as if his words were felt, not heard. He began to show me things, visions I couldn't fully understand, but that seemed to answer questions I had carried for years. Questions about who I was, about the purpose of black people, about the suffering that seemed endless. He didn't give me simple answers. He showed me the truth, and the truth was much greater than I could have imagined. The first thing he showed me was about the so-called curse of Ham. I had always heard about it, and it had always bothered me, but I never fully understood it. Jesus explained to me, in a way I had never heard before, that it was a distortion, a lie used to justify horrible things. He made me see that the curse was never about all of Ham's descendants, but something specific, something that had been manipulated over time to oppress, to hurt. I felt a weight lifting off me, as if something I had been carrying without even realizing it had been removed. He told me that African ancestors were not cursed, but blessed with a deep spiritual wisdom, a connection to the divine that many couldn't understand. And then he showed me visions of ancient African kingdoms, places I had never imagined. I saw grand cities, people living in harmony, rituals that weren't just rituals, but expressions of deep spirituality. He explained to me that this wisdom had been passed down from generation to generation, even in the darkest times, even when everything seemed lost. I felt a pride I had never felt before, a pride in knowing that my history didn't begin with pain, but with a blessing, with a direct connection to the divine. And that changed everything for me. But then came the hardest part to understand. Jesus showed me the suffering, all the suffering that black people had endured throughout history. I saw scenes that made me want to close my eyes, but he didn't let me. He made me look, and at the same time, he explained that this pain wasn't a punishment, it wasn't a curse. It was part of something greater, something I couldn't fully understand at that moment. He compared this suffering to his own sacrifice on the cross, and that left me speechless. He told me that just as he used pain to bring redemption, the suffering of black people also had a purpose. It was as if, through that pain, we had shown the world the power of forgiveness, faith, and love, even when everything seemed lost. I cried. I cried a lot. They weren't tears of sadness, but of relief, of understanding. He showed me that our resilience, our ability to love even when the world hated us, was a reflection of his own character. And then he told me something I will never forget. You were prepared for something greater. The wisdom you carry, the faith you maintained, will be crucial in the times to come. I didn't fully understand what he meant at that moment, but I felt a weight of responsibility, as if I had a mission, something I needed to share with the world. He continued to show me visions, but now they were of the future. I saw moments of chaos, of confusion, but I also saw black people guiding others, sharing this spiritual wisdom that had been preserved for generations. He told me that our ability to maintain faith under pressure, to find joy in suffering, would be a beacon for many who would be lost. I felt a mix of fear and hope. Fear because it seemed like something too big for me, but hope because I finally understood that all of this had a purpose. He told me that in the coming kingdom, those who were last would be honored as first. And that filled me with a joy I can't explain. And then he gave me a command. It wasn't an order in an authoritarian sense, but something I felt deep within, as if it were a mission I couldn't ignore. He told me I needed to share everything I had seen and heard, that it was time to awaken people to these truths. I felt a fire within me, an urgency I had never felt before, and before I could ask more, he made me return. Suddenly, I was back in my body, hearing the sounds of the hospital, the doctors talking, the machines beeping. I was alive, but completely transformed. When I opened my eyes, the hospital light blinded me for a moment. Everything seemed so ordinary. The white walls, the smell of antiseptic, the sound of the machines beside me. I was back, but I wasn't the same. My body ached, but it was a distant pain, as if it weren't entirely mine. The doctors and nurses crowded around me, speaking loudly, full of urgency. One of them said something about me having come back, as if I had gone somewhere. And I had. I knew I had gone. But how could I explain that to them? How could I explain that I had been in a place where time didn't exist, where the light was alive, and where I had spoken to Jesus? I couldn't speak properly. My throat was dry and the words seemed stuck, but inside me there was a stirring, a need to tell what I had seen. I looked at the people around me and felt a mix of gratitude and frustration. Gratitude for being alive, for having another chance, but frustration because I knew no one there would understand. How could I explain that I had died, that I had seen things that challenged everything I thought I knew, and at the same time, how could I stay silent? Jesus had given me a mission, and I felt that if I didn't fulfill it, something important would be lost. In the days that followed, while I was still in the hospital, I had a lot of time to think. Visits from my family and church members were constant, and everyone talked about the miracle of my survival. They said God had a purpose for me, and I knew they were right, but not in the way they imagined. I wanted to tell everything, but I didn't know where to start. How could I explain something so big, so profound? I tried to talk about the light, the peace, the visions, but the words seemed too small. People listened, but I could see in their eyes that they didn't fully understand. And how could they? I was still trying to understand myself. It was when my pastor came to visit that I felt I could try to explain better. She had always been a woman with faith, someone I admired greatly. When I started talking about the curse of Ham and how Jesus had shown me it was a lie, I saw something change in her face. She didn't interrupt me, just listened, and when I finished, she was silent for a moment. Then she took my hand and said, "Olivia, this isn't just for you. This is for all of us." Those words echoed within me, and I knew she was right. I couldn't keep this to myself. It was bigger than me. When I finally returned home, I felt I needed to do more. I started writing down everything I remembered, every detail, every word Jesus had told me. It was hard because some things were so big they seemed impossible to put on paper, but I knew I had to try. I talked to my pastor again, and she suggested I share my testimony at church. At first, I was afraid of not being taken seriously, afraid people would think I was making things up. But then, I remembered the peace I had felt there, in that light, and I knew I couldn't stay silent. The following Sunday, I was there in front of the congregation. My hands were shaking and my heart was pounding, but when I started speaking, something changed. The words flowed, and I felt like it wasn't me speaking, but something greater. I talked about the light, about Jesus, about the visions of African kingdoms, and about the divine purpose in suffering. When I finished, there was silence in the church, a silence that seemed charged with something sacred. And then, people started coming up to me, some crying, others with eyes full of awe. I knew not everyone would fully understand, but I also knew I had planted a seed. And this was just the beginning. One of the things that struck me the most was when Jesus showed me that the suffering of black people was not in vain. He made me see that just as he used the cross to bring redemption, the suffering of my people also had a purpose. It wasn't a curse, but a preparation. He showed me that our ability to love, even when the world hated us, was a reflection of his own character. That changed everything for me. I had always seen slavery, segregation, racism as a story of pain and injustice, and that was true. But now I saw that there was more. There was a story of resilience, of faith, of love that transcended all of that. And then he showed me that the spiritual wisdom of our ancestors was not lost. Even in the darkest times, even when everything seemed hopeless, this wisdom was passed down from generation to generation. He made me see that this wisdom would be crucial in the times to come. I didn't fully understand what that meant at the time, but I felt a weight of responsibility. It was as if I had been chosen to help awaken people to this truth. And I knew I couldn't do it alone. I needed my community, my church, everyone willing to listen. I started studying more about the history of my people, something I had never done so deeply before. I read about the great African kingdoms, about the cultural and spiritual wealth that existed before colonization. And the more I read, the more I saw that Jesus was right. Our ancestors were not primitive or cursed people. They had a deep connection to the divine, an understanding of spirituality that many of us had lost over time. I began sharing this in my talks at church and in community meetings. People were surprised, some even skeptical, but I could see in the eyes of many a spark of recognition, as if something inside them was awakening. One of the most powerful things I shared was about the curse of Ham. I explained how this story had been distorted to justify slavery and oppression, but that Jesus had shown me this was never God's intention. He made me see that the real curse was the hatred, greed, and cruelty of those who use the Bible to justify their crimes. And he showed me that, in the kingdom of God, those who were humiliated and oppressed would be honored. That message touched people in a way I had never seen before. I saw tears, hugs, and a sense of hope that seemed contagious. Today, I look back and see how that experience changed everything for me. My faith is not the same. Before I had doubts, questions that seemed to have no answers. Now, I know that God has a plan, not just for me, but for all my people. I see the history of black people in a completely different way. It's no longer a story of pain and suffering, but a story of resilience, faith, and a deep connection to the divine. I feel honored to be part of this, to have been chosen to share these truths. But at the same time, there are still things I can't explain. How was it possible to see all that in just 15 minutes? How could I feel so much love, so much peace, in a place that wasn't of this world? I don't have all the answers, and maybe I never will. But one thing I know, that experience was real. It was more real than anything I've ever lived. And I know I'm not alone. Jesus showed me that he is with me, with my people, and that everything we've been through is part of a greater plan. That gives me hope, not just for me, but for everyone willing to listen. Sometimes when I'm alone, I close my eyes and try to remember that light. It's hard to describe, but it was as if it were alive, pulsating with an energy I had never felt before. I miss that peace, that feeling of being completely safe, completely loved. But then I remember that the light is still with me, inside me. Jesus showed me that he never abandons us, that he is always with us, even in the hardest moments. And that gives me strength to keep going, to keep sharing what I saw and heard, even when doubts and fears try to stop me. Today, I don't have all the answers, and maybe I never will. But I have one certainty. That experience changed everything for me. It wasn't something I sought. It wasn't something I expected. It simply happened, and I know it was real. I don't know why I was chosen, or why I had to go through everything I did to get here, but I know there's a purpose in all of this, and I will keep moving forward, sharing what I can, in the hope that these truths can bring healing, restoration, and a deeper understanding of God's love to everyone willing to listen. Because in the end, that's what matters, that everyone may know they are loved, that they have a purpose, and that they are never alone. In the months that followed, I realized that not everyone was ready to hear what I had to say. Some people at church started looking at me with suspicion, as if I had made it all up. Others asked for proof, as if I could show something tangible from that experience. I understood their skepticism, because if I were in their place, I might have doubted too. But I couldn't prove anything. All I had was my word and the conviction in my heart that it had happened. And little by little, I realized I didn't need to convince anyone. My mission was to share, not to force people to believe. One of the hardest things was dealing with questions I couldn't answer. Why you? Why now? What does this mean for the future? I didn't have all the answers, and that frustrated me at times. But then I remembered the peace I had felt there, in that light, and I knew I didn't need to have all the answers. I just needed to be faithful to what had been revealed to me. And little by little, I learned to live with these uncertainties, understanding that faith isn't about having all the answers, but about trusting even when we don't understand. Over time, I began to incorporate the revelations into my life in a more practical way. I started studying more about African history, not just to understand the past, but to find connections with the present. I traveled to libraries, attended lectures, and even organized a study group at church to discuss topics like African spirituality and the reinterpretation of Bible passages that had been used to justify oppression. It was amazing to see how people started to get interested, how those conversations sparked deep and sometimes emotional debates. I could see in their eyes that something was changing, that they were starting to see history and faith from a new perspective. My own spirituality also changed. Before, I saw God as something distant, something I needed to constantly seek, but that always seemed out of reach. Now, I feel him closer, as if he were in everything around me. When I look at the sky, the trees, the people around me, I see his presence. And I understand that spirituality isn't just about prayers and rituals, but about recognizing the sacred in all things. That has brought me a peace I had never felt before, a peace that sustains me even on the hardest days. Today, I look back and see that this experience wasn't just about me. It was about something much greater, something I'm still trying to fully understand. I know I'm not the only one who has gone through something like this, and maybe there are many others out there carrying revelations that need to be shared. I don't know why I was chosen, but I'm grateful for the opportunity to have seen what I saw and heard what I heard. And I will keep sharing, not because I want to convince anyone, but because I believe these truths can bring healing and hope to those willing to listen. There are still days when I catch myself thinking about that light, that peace I felt. Sometimes I miss it, as if a part of me is still there. But then I remember that the light never really left me. It's here, inside me, and in all the people willing to open their hearts to God's love. I don't know what the future holds, but I know I'm not alone. And in the end, that's what matters. knowing that we are loved, that we have a purpose, and that no matter what happens, we are never alone.